Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. If you'd like to, please share where you're calling in from today. It's always fun to see where everybody is. I'm Dara, and I'm in San Francisco. We've got some more Californians from Oregon. Just actually went to Santa Cruz this weekend for the first time in probably a year, and that was awesome. Okay, well, I'm gonna just get us going, and then there should be a lot more people who are gonna be joining along the way. So welcome everyone to What Really Matters, Harnessing the Wisdom of Loss to Thrive, with Claire Bidwell Smith, Lua Arthur, and Dr. BJ Miller, and who are really three of my favorite, favorite Reimagine folks. I mean, I love them bigger than that, but in my Reimagine world, it's always exciting to do an event with them. And I'm Dara Cosberg. I am the program director at Reimagine. And for those who are new to Reimagine, we are a nonprofit organization that sparks community experiences like this one, that empowers individuals, families, communities, really to face the hardest parts of our existence, including serious illness and death, while inspiring people to celebrate life and one another. And I just have a few kind of housekeeping things to do before we jump in. So first, I just want to thank our 2021 sponsors who are shown here, who support Reimagine and help make this work possible. I also want to say a huge thank you to all those who have donated. Those individual donations really do make this work possible as well. And thank you for letting us offer free events such as this one. So today you are going to be hearing from Claire Bidwell Smith, who's a grief therapist and author, Lua Arthur, who is a death doula and the CEO of Going with Grace, and Dr. BJ Miller, who is a palliative care doctor and CEO of Metal Health. So with that, I'm going to let you all take it away. Are you able to?
Can everyone hear us?
Yes.
Hey. All right. I guess I just started talking, so I guess I'll start talking. Well, hi. Thank you, Dara. Hi, everybody. We're glad to be together. Big old topic and a big old time. So I'll just say, there's maybe even just to begin to set the table at all, there's a lot to say, and we'll probably, some of the things will be old hat to folks in the crowd and some new, and who knows. But I mean, for starters, let's simply just say that, just get clear that grief is normal, is human, is essential even, and is appropriate all over the place. I mean, I think it's not just loss around death. It could be loss of any kind. And once you sort of get tuned into grief, my guess is that most of us are in some amount of grief all the time because we're either losing something, recently lost something, or afraid we're going to lose something. So grief's all over the human experience. And until recently, for whatever reason, in the West has got very short shrift. And I think that has a lot to do with some of the built up anxieties in our society. I'll just say one more thing about that. I honestly think if there's one muscle we all have to exercise right now and that could sort of springboard us into new and in some ways a better place would be this grief muscle. I think we probably all have a backlog of this stuff. So anyway, there's some opening comments. Jump in here with me, guys, any old time.
Lua, you take it away, dude. PJ just cracks me up. You guys are in for a treat. The three of us have a funny relationship. We all know each other really well. And sometimes we say things that make each other laugh, but no, it's serious. I think, yes, on the grief muscle. This last year has been really interesting, beyond interesting. The pandemic, as it's starting to shift here in the United States, we're starting to move forward. But I don't think we can move forward until we really kind of process a lot of what's happened in the last year. So that is what the three of us are coming together to do. We come from three different angles in the same theme, right? Death doula, grief therapist, palliative care doctor. We're all looking at death and grief and end of life and trying to do it with a lot of compassion, trying to really show up for it. And even all of us are really still trying to learn from it, I think, and help others learn from it and grow is our goal. And I think there's still some grieving to do for the pandemic and all that's happened. I think people we've lost, things we've lost, infrastructures, racism, there's just been so much that has unfurled in the last year that needs processing. And a lot of it is grief-based. And I think that sometimes we aren't able to grieve until we are feeling safe again. So now that we are starting to feel safe again and get vaccinated and reemerge into the world, it's kind of an amazing opportunity to start to grieve. And I think that is often what grief is. I think about it a lot as an opportunity. I have been a grief therapist for over a decade. I lost both of my parents young and have been through a lot of my own personal grief and worked in hospice for a long time. And I see in the midst of a lot of pain and fear that occurs in big losses, I also see a lot of opportunity to kind of explore ourselves, explore the world around us, explore what it means to be human, what it means to love. And so I think that's really a goal of what Elua and BJ and I all try to do, coming at it from different angles. And we kind of all speak the same language and adore each other. And I always am happy to talk with you guys. So I'm happy to be here today and to kind of open up this Pandora's box of grief muscles. Elua?
Yeah, we're all getting real strong with the grief muscle lately. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day today to come and be with us in this conversation. As both Claire and BJ have said, we thoroughly enjoy the conversation amongst ourselves, but even better when there are people that are also committed to looking at the ways in which they've been showing up and the ways in which they're integrating loss. It's been a dense, really, really, really dense, I keep saying year, but it's been more than that at this point, where death and grief has been in the forefront of our minds, where we're watching the news and there are death counts going and we are finding a new way to get into what's been happening in our lives. And as Claire mentioned, I see a great opportunity for all of us. I don't always look at it that way because sometimes the pain just sucks and that's okay. And so since I come from the death world as a death doula, I often look at it as an event that's occurred and then what we do with everything that comes after that event, but the necessary to first honor and acknowledge that event. I don't necessarily mean the pandemic overall, since we've been doing that by force, but also acknowledging the losses that we've experienced. One of the ways in which I've begun to think about it is looking directly at the little losses, the ones that maybe I'm actively grieving without awareness of, and then using those as a way to spotlight out and look at the bigger losses. Maybe it's too hard to claim that I'm feeling a lot of sadness and difficulty over the life that I thought that I had, as opposed to the one that's moving forward. But I can claim that I'm really frustrated that there's no parking on the street anymore because everybody's home all the time. You know, that's a little loss. Doesn't seem like much, but it does cause me some feeling and frustration. How am I with that? And then using that to spotlight onto the bigger ones and bigger ones so I can properly integrate those losses as well. So it's clear, I come from the death world, but death and grief are inexorably linked and married because they come so close together. But I often just defer to Claire when I get big grief questions because somehow people seem to think that once you're in death, you know everything about all the things that go along with it. But Claire's the expert here, and BJ coming from the medical side. The three of us have come together to put together what I think will be a really useful and hopefully fun and deepening experience at a retreat that we're having in October. Where we'll explore all different types of loss and how we can use that to further ourselves in our lives.
In-person retreat, guys. We're going to be together in person.
We're fun together. I mean, we're fun on the internet too, but we're really fun together. So hopefully we'll use that time to see what matters to us individually, honoring our unique experience, our unique losses, our unique griefs, and find ways to forward us in our lives.
I love
Right
that.
on.
I'm so glad you said the part about opportunity. I think I meant it around the pandemic. You're right. There's some grief that is grief, and you are sitting with it, and it is too painful to find meaning or opportunity, especially in the beginning of going through a really huge loss. But I think the pandemic right now, kind of shifting through that as a culture, as a species, there is an interesting opportunity. I think we've learned so much, but it comes with uncomfortability, with pain, with frustration. But a question I want to ask you, I love that you brought up the parking spot grief. I've noticed something that's been happening this last year as people talk about, I've been so heartened to see that people have talked so much about all the different ways we can grieve, right? Like that hasn't been recognized as much as I've ever seen it in the last year. It's been incredible to see. However, alongside it, of course, I've seen this kind of grief shaming where people are like, they'll immediately take you down for saying that you're grieving the parking spaces. They'll be like, do you know how many people are grieving like a person or something else? And you're not allowed to grieve that. I would love to hear what the two of you guys have to say about kind of this toxic positivity, because I'm always wanting people to grieve a parking space, grieve all the things you need to grieve. It's healthy. But I see so often, especially on the internet, other people setting parameters for how we're supposed to grieve. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, you guys.
I can jump in on that one too. Yeah, good. It's a great question, and it comes up in palliative care circles one way and another. And for me, as an obviously disabled person, it comes up a lot where people will say, "Oh, they assume if you're missing limbs or you got this or that going on, that their suffering isn't as big as yours, and therefore doesn't have a place in the world, or vice versa." It goes in all directions. I mean, I think Anne answered, or beginning of an answer to your question, Claire, is like, don't fall into the trap of comparing, contrasting your pain to another person's. It's a dead end. You will not. It can be, I suppose, underneath it. Let's just say that everything we do as human beings, let's assume comes from that there's some nugget in there that it's coming from a thoughtful place. So on this note, I do think we're social critters, right? It's hard for us to know how we're doing without kind of gauging against some others. I don't know if any of you guys have spent some huge time alone out in the woods, or anywhere else. When you're unchecked by others, it's amazing how far adrift we can go. And if we're just left to our own devices, it can get a little gnarly. So there is something important about us bouncing off each other's experiences, no doubt about it, but it should stop there. And the discernment's one thing, but the judgment piece is wholly another. I mean, yes, compare and contrast to kind of give yourself a sense of where you are, but let it go there. I've seen so many people cause more pain to themselves by corking it up, that they don't think their pain's enough. And so, yes, I suppose I'm just repeating your point, Claire, just simply to really encourage all of us to not fall in the trap of comparing or contrasting our sufferings with others. It's all part of, not only because that can be offensive to another person, but it can be offensive to yourself. You're not giving yourself the credit, the space, whatever that you need. And what does that do? That just perpetuates the pain. That does no one any good. I mean, I think one of the reasons underlying why we're so interested in grief is not because we're, masochists for ourselves or sadists towards others. I mean, there's a lot of pain in here. So it's not like we're, yay, pain. The point is to grieve so that you deal with yourself, so that you own your own experience, so you get the help you need. And then, for those of us who are bent towards the feelings of others, empaths, one of the best reasons to grieve is so you don't accidentally spray your pain all over the place. And that happens a lot with unprocessed grief. People who don't give themselves credit for that parking space issue or whatever it is. And then it grows and it gets teeth and gets horns and gets weird. And then we're just hurting. This phrase that's come up a lot lately is, it's a pretty good one, but hurt people hurt people. And so one way to stop some of these cycles of just moving pain off ourselves and onto others is to actually grieve, because with that comes the sort of awareness, honoring the thing that's lost, big or small, and then the awareness of what we still have. And then you can pop out the other side with your eyes wide open and full of love in the setting you're lost. So Anyway, if you need a reason to grieve, that may be one of the top ones. So we don't accidentally just keep hurting each other. Anyway, I will stop for a second there. There's some thoughts for you.
Wow, great. Thank you. I want to hear Lua's take on it.
Powerful thoughts, but I'm actually just going to borrow something you said before to me, I think, Claire, which is this comparing of grief as the grief Olympics. You know, like who has the biggest grief, like who's allowed to grieve because they have the biggest loss, or like the worst one or the most pain, while refusing to acknowledge that it's entirely relative, that something that's difficult for me may not be as challenging for my fellow human, and how can we hold each other for exactly who and where we are when we're there, rather than trying to see what makes more sense, or who deserves all of the pain, or who deserves all the attention because they either had a more recent loss, or it was a parent as opposed to a grandparent, and so on and so forth. It's challenging to be in relationship where we're constantly trying to one up the other one anyway. But particularly when it comes to pain, not only is it confusing, but as BJ said, also very detrimental. I also want to touch on this idea, which as social creatures we're often trying to do, which is fix each other's pain, trying to make it better, trying to make it go away. And I have to admit that I am very much a fixer. I've always found issues in the world that I want to make better. Part of the reason I got into the practice of law in social justice was a desire to make better what I saw in the world that I didn't think worked very well. And so I wanted to fix it somehow, and then found myself in death work where there's absolutely nothing to fix, that we simply cannot fix death. And since we can't do anything about it, how can I just be with what is, rather than trying to make it better, trying to fix it for somebody? And echoing BJ earlier, yeah, it comes from a really soft and juicy place in us that hurts to see somebody else hurting, and wanting to offer something to make it a little bit better. Many of the comments or thoughts that I hear that start with, well, at least she lived till 96. At least he didn't suffer a long time. At least you still have a car, so you don't have to worry about your parking spot. At least you still have a job. At least you have a strong internet. At least. Anytime we do something like that, directly invalidates the experience of somebody that we love, somebody that we care about, or just even another fellow human. One thing that I've also really found fascinating is this idea that we're often, I find myself wanting somebody else to validate my experience for what it is, without their perspective on what it should be or what it could be. And I think as humans, being as we're social creatures, it's necessary that we continue to find ways to continue acknowledging and validating the experience of another, even when we can't understand it, even when it's something so far outside of what we're doing. This has come up repeatedly in the context of the racial reckoning that this country has been in for the last month, which should have been 400 years, but I'll take it for the last year or so. How can we acknowledge and hold the experience of another that is not mine and that I simply can't understand? It's an opportunity that we have time and again when it comes to grief to say, I don't know what it feels like to lose a cat. I'm not even that crazy about cats, but I know that it is hurting you. And can I be with you in your pain without needing to fix it at all?
Yeah, I love the word curiosity. Like, can we just be more curious about each other rather than judging and shaming? Like, let's be curious. Let's be curious about grief. Let's be curious about each other's experiences. Let's be curious about pain. So what were you going to say, BJ?
As Alua was talking, that sometimes, we may have, it depends who we're talking to. Obviously, this is such rich territory. This will not allow us to memorize a few lines that you can, when you bump into someone grieving, say X, Y, or Z. It's just not that easy. And thank goodness. In fact, actually, some of the best responses are just sort of awkward. Like, gosh, I don't know what to say, there's something actually very tender about not having a very polished response. So just to sort of build on what Alua is saying, to own this space means oftentimes just sitting with hard, awkward, weird silence, awkward feelings, but there's nothing more cathartic or constructive than a sort of a genuine response from someone. So if you find yourself feeling clunky or I'm bad at grief, no, that probably means you're actually pretty good at it. It does not, don't try to put it in a box. Don't try to put a bow on it. And then the other thing I was going to say, also in reference to Alua, depending on who you're talking to whom you are talking, it can be, there's some times where we do have some experience with this, and that might be actually helpful for this person to hear. And a way to handle that is simply to ask. You simply say, man, I'm feeling you. At some point, I have some thoughts on this from my own experience. If it ever be helpful, I'm happy to share with you. You can just sort of say something like that, open it up. But just asking the person who's in the grieving shoes at the moment their permission, or just something like that, can be a very beautiful way to handle it, rather than just foisting your stuff on them. Because even if what you're telling them is actually apropos what they're going to and exactly what they need to hear, so much depends on how it's presented. So simply asking permission, being a little awkward, those are some of the most beautiful moments I've seen around grief.
Yeah. I don't want us to miss this opportunity culturally to grieve. Like, BJ, I know you've talked before publicly and in conversations we've had about how you feel like perhaps you didn't always grieve when you had the opportunity, and that it's this very tender place, that we can enter into. And I think when we really can go into that space and find ways to do it, and the thing is, our culture isn't great at making that space. So that's what we're trying to do here. And that's why you guys are showing up here. You're looking for that space, and we're trying to help you find it. And I really think that when we can sit with that pain and sit with all of the questions that come with loss, we can grow exponentially. And when we don't, when we skip the opportunity, when we push it away, it ends up in anxiety and depression and judgment, and anger and all of these other things. What do you guys think it means to create space to grieve? Like, what have you done in your time or your worlds to do that?
Hey, Lua, you gonna go, girl?
Oh my gosh, sure, I can try. I struggled with this for a long time personally, before I started to understand that pushing grief and difficult experiences away only meant that they popped up elsewhere, either in simple ways like on my skin with pimples, or in more complicated ways like a clinical depression that I experienced a few years back, where I've been trying to constantly see the light in things rather than paying attention to the difficulty that I was having. And by doing that, it just popped up elsewhere. And when I recognized that that's what was happening, I started to give myself space to feel the feelings that I was having. For a long time, I've been focusing on acknowledging my feeling for what it is at that moment, but also, as of late, recognizing that perhaps it's not necessary to feel all of the feelings all of the time. And sometimes it's more helpful for me to not feel some of them, numb them, distract, go on a hike, do something else, rather than just sit there, because it's sometimes not productive to just sit in whatever it is that's happening. And so give my space to feel, and then also acknowledge when perhaps I need to do something else, to let something else arise from that space. My favorite grieving techniques. I love chips, as we talk about all the time. I just love potato chips. I love crunchy, salty things. Looking out the window is one of my absolute favorite activities. Going on hikes, being with friends, doing anything that gets me in the body, dance, exercise, things that allow me to get the feeling in the spaces where it needs to go to, and then eventually out. Not necessarily for the goal of fixing it, not for the goal of moving through it, but rather giving myself space to actually be with it. What are you into, BJ?
Right on. All those things. For me, time with Mother Nature and my animals. I live with 2 cats and a dog. So non-humans do a lot of stuff for me in this space, because they're not pretending to find words for it. They're not trying to fix me. They're just being. And that's so much the trick here, is just being with what is, and watching our intellects try to harness it, put it in a tube, chunk it aside, put it on a shelf, all the stuff that our brains do. I mean, I think for me, another one of the sort of meta themes of grief, and why I'm such a fan of it, is it has a way to get you beyond your thoughts, if you roll with it. And so, for me, a good sweat, getting outside, can be very, very helpful. Time with the animals. Again, they're not looking at me wishing I was somewhere else. They're not looking at their own lives and wishing it were someone else. They're just rolling with life all the time. Loss, gain, loss, gain. It's just this ongoing churning thing. So I get a lot of inspiration just by watching nature do its thing, and then reminding myself I'm part of nature. But one way or another, for me, it's been so much. Claire, you referenced, earlier, I have experience trying to stuff grief down. When I lost my sister 20 years ago is the biggest example of my life, and how that just bit me in the ass again and then again and again before I finally kind of dealt with it years later. And the other reason why that I was so good to deal with it finally was that then not only did I deal with metabolize some of these harder feelings, but then by daring to go into those hard feelings, I went into my relationship with my sister. And so thanks to grief, I got to have to reawaken an active life with my sister, with the person who's gone. That was such a huge reward. And now I feel that all the time. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of just tricks of how to roll with this stuff is it's almost like high school English class where the good writers, teach you to use adjectives sparingly, if at all. And I like that for myself too. Just drop the adjectives, just see whatever the hell the feeling is. Not good, bad, better, worse, blah, blah, blah. Just dump all that stuff and just try to be with what is and let myself have the thoughts and feelings without grading them, without judging them. That's been the trick. And the carrot is, like I said, the carrot is to going through that is then on the far side, I have this open relationship with this thing called loss, and I get to feel kind of courageous for dealing with loss in the first place. And before you know it, I don't hate myself so much anymore. So there you go.
I love it.
Mm.
I feel like mine has always been writing and creativity and just expressing all of the stuff that's going on. I also, like Alua said, I feel too much and have a really hard time turning it off. So I just channel it and just put it into writing, try to get it out in that way. Dancing really scares me. So writing is my thing. I'm a terrible dancer. But one of the things I was thinking about was how the reason I love you guys so much. It's not the reason I love you, but I've found that some of the people I love the most in the world and am the most inspired by and excited by are people who kind of know the edges of the world, who like have gone to those places or have felt those places, or who are, really can lean into death and think about it and think about the fact that we're not going to be here forever. And I've found that it from when I worked hospice and like all the amazing nurses and doctors there, I felt like everybody just learned how to live more as a result of talking and being in the death world. And I find that fascinating. And for me, I feel like it took me a long time. Like after my parents died, I was kind of an anxious wreck for a while. I tried really hard not to feel all the things. And, that led to bad behaviors and a lot of like trying to shut down and run away from stuff. And when I finally like let go and just embraced everything that these losses had been for me, that was when I kind of opened up to life in all the ways that I love it now for, I feel like I feel so present to my life. It's still painful and crazy and complicated and frustrating, but I feel like I can lean into it in ways that I wasn't able to before. And I was wondering if you guys could talk on like, what death has taught you, how it's taught you how to live a more meaningful life, because that's kind of what we're going to be talking a lot about at this retreat too.
I can jump in. Yeah, you feel me go, we gotta jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think the title of our talk, like sort of the wisdom of loss, wisdom of grief, those aren't just, we're not just trying to put a spin on this thing. There is something just from our own experience, and we're just empirically, we see how we've grown from these losses. And there's something about the human experience, the relationship between joy and sorrow and loss, gain. I used to look for a way to tease those out so we could all have the good stuff and none of the bad stuff. It just doesn't, it just was a big fat waste of time. I mean, if someone could figure that out, I guess maybe I'd be interested. But as you're talking, Claire, like dealing with these things is the same thing as dealing with being alive, is the same thing as dealing with being a human being. And that generally feels good. That gets you in sync with reality rather than being at odds with reality. And being at odds with reality is exhausting and really hard and the opposite of life affirming. So there's a little bit of courage here, daring to go. Or in my case, like one of my injuries it wasn't a choice. It was very helpful for me to actually be overwhelmed, have a loss come along that was just, there was no choosing anything. I just got smacked hard enough that I had to pay attention to myself in a new way. And I'm so glad I did, because there's all this richness waiting for me on the far side. So I can't remember where I was going. I think I had a larger point, but I can't remember where I was going with all that, except to say, I think this isn't, this isn't, these aren't detours in life. They may be, if you had a plan in place, they may be taking you off your plan, but don't confuse your plan with life. I mean, this is life. These are not anomalous events. These aren't detours. This is this is the deal. All right, circling back to the idea of learning from death. So I'll circle back to answer that point. By naming this is the same thing as life. First of all, you get to own it in a different way. You get to feel the pride of being alive and feeling anything. You know, having danced with numbness, I've come circled back and realized I'm just grateful to feel just about anything, especially when I take away the adjectives, good, bad. It's amazing to be able to feel anything. And having come close to sort of signing my rights away to feeling anything, whew, that's a death. And so this whole death as a teacher, well, first of all, it gives us a sense of our own limits. It brings us humility that way. It gives us a bunch of unanswerable questions about which to be curious, like you said earlier, Claire, which is a super life force, a compelling way forward through just about anything. It teaches you what you're afraid to lose and therefore what you love. It just can be this very edifying force. And if you really roll with it, you get bigger as you roll with it. Your capacity to sit with this big thing called reality gets bigger, which is a beautiful experience. And in the end, too, if you're really, for my money, if you're really rolling with it, one way or another, you get to a point where you see life outside of yourself. You see yourself in a way outside yourself. And so, yeah, I'm going to die. My ego, myself, this body's going to die, but life will go on. And the more feel part of that life outside of myself, in a sense, that's my ticket to immortality. BJ won't necessarily be around for it, but I'll be part of something that keeps going. And that to me is one of my favorite lessons of death, is to get us in touch with these larger forces that are in and around us. Okay, now I'll stop. Thank you for listening.
I wish you wouldn't, because I'm just sitting here. Thank God I'm mute, because I'm like, yeah, hard is hard. I love it. But then you said immortality, and I was like, oh. One of the things that I love so much about what you just said, and also you at the beginning, Claire, about what I appreciate about both of you and generally the humans that I like to collect and stay in relationship with, is this ability to be messy. Is this ability to not have to have it right all the time, to do the best that I can with what I had when I did it, and give myself a little bit of grace in the process. And I think that grace has to extend also to the end of our lives, which is why I named the company Going with Grace, is that to me, that's the highest expression and the best that I can hope for. I'm not going to do it all right. I've done very little right. But I have to say, honestly, the question that I ask myself most, well, maybe second to am I bored or am I hungry, is am I doing it right? I ask myself that question all the time. Am I doing this right? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? And then just checking in with, well, where are the rule books on it? Who gave me the rule book? Where did I get it from? Did it come from society? Did it come from inside of me? Did it come from my parents? Does it come as a result of my race or my gender? Or where did this come from? I talked about this client of mine on the last time the three of us got to chat, but I'll just share it with you all here. Is a few years back, I had a client who was 94 years old. She was in an elder care facility in Los Angeles, and her children had asked me to sit with her on the days that they couldn't. She had Parkinson's and had been confined to the bed for many years at that point. And she had the last bed of 3 in a room that had a TV next to the window that was on all day long. You know, the highlight of her day was when I'd come by, we'd talk, and I'd paint her nails and help her fix her hair. And I also noticed that she had pictures of herself from back in the day up around her bed. And so I asked her about that woman, you know, who she was, because she was the same woman, but much older at this point. A lot of life had happened in between. And I also noticed that she had her hair up in this French roll that she'd worn for a while when she was younger, but in her elder years had stopped paying so much attention to her appearance. She had a couple of hairs on her chin that she'd asked me to tweeze for her, so I did lovingly. And, you know, one day after listening to her stories for about 6 months, She's in a wheelchair, and we go out into the garden. And I was at a point in my life where I'd made some decisions that I wasn't sure whether or not they were right for me or where I wanted to go in my life, and things weren't showing up the way that I wanted them to. And I asked her, looking back, like, does it make any sense? Do your 93, 94 years make any sense at all? And she said, without missing a beat, baby, I didn't do nothing right, but boy, was it one hell of a ride. And I think this goes right back to what BJ was just talking about, like looking at life for what it is, all the messy parts, the fun parts, the plans, the things that happen that aren't exposed to, the beautiful serendipity that brings us to life anyway, but also the serendipity that brought the three of us together and that has brought you here today, being with life as it is. And so for me, that's part of the wisdom in loss, is recognizing what I've still got. The things don't go the way that I expected, but I've got this instead. Okay, what do I do with this? What do I do with this? This is actually my life, not the way that I thought it was supposed to go. And acknowledging that, even seeing that this is the way that I thought it was going and this is the way that's going, requires a bit of grieving in between to make the two reconcile. So to me, that's part of the greatest wisdom of loss and of being with death and dying, the difference between what I thought and where I'm at. How do I bridge those two? Yeah. So this, yeah.
Guys, I was just gonna jump in about, should we open up to some questions, guys? Would that be useful? Yeah, sorry.
That's just what I was gonna say, BJ.
Well, we speak each other's minds, girl. Yeah. So how do we want to do this?
Gordon has his hand raised. Gordon, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself. And
I'll unmute everybody. So
cool.
Just because we have a setting, so let me unmute Gordon. So Gordon, it's gonna like tell you that I want you to unmute yourself, and you should be able to do it.
Done deal. Thank you so much. I definitely wanted to respond briefly to 2 points, and which will lead to the question. First is that I concur with giving oneself an emotional shower. I think it's necessary. For me, it's going to see a film that I would not admit having seen. And at the same time, I recognize that unmet grief or grieving leads to apathy and to nihilism, and that's definitely a concern. And the question that that comes out of is the acknowledgement, the recognition that the volume, the veracity of societal sanctioned death doesn't afford the opportunities for communities to collectively grieve. And as such, young people are then faced with apathy, which leads to nihilism. And I would like to know from your collective experiences, I recognize when I say community, we're talking a large number, but what are some of the steps that we can start having a conversation that allows us to grieve? By example, I recognize that I hadn't grieved at one point for George Floyd. And I said, I need to give myself space to do that. And as I was doing that, then I realized, I said, wait, I got to grieve for Sandra Bland. And then when I started to do that, then I said, okay, well, I need to grieve for Eleanor Bumpus. And then I said, well, I can't grieve for each one of them because it's just too many. So maybe I need to then think about grieving for, I'm now not grieving for the past. I'm not even grieving in the present. I'm grieving for the future, because we know that yet another is bound to happen. And that's not an external looking and saying to someone who may not be of the community that is actually having these indiscriminate wanton acts of death to say, we collectively feel your pain, or even to bow down with us. But it is, how do we start giving hope to young people, and the strength of a community coming together to collectively grieve when they're grieving about, what the future may hold for them. And that's eerily, and I'll stop with this, that's eerily reminiscent of the millions of Africans who decided to jump overboard on the slave ships because they weren't grieving, they were grieving about what the future held for them. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's big. As I feel like this has been, I'm happy that this has been coming up so much. This idea that you want to grieve and then there's still so much to grieve ahead of us, or you can't grieve because the thing has just happened again in another context. This idea that I kind of spoke about a little bit in the beginning, like sometimes we can't grieve until we feel safe or until the thing is over. But in this case, in the case of police shootings and racism, it's not over, you know, so it's continuing to unfurl. And so how do we find space to grieve? And I've been thinking about the apathy as well, because it's real, you know, when we can't find that space, that foothold to find any space to grieve, the apathy does set in. And I think that's always why I'm so grateful to see so many people here. This is where we find little tiny moments where we get to do that. You know, I think it's like a millimeter of a step forward, 2 steps back. I don't know. We keep going like a little bit forward, a little bit back, but finding these tiny footholds where we can talk about this more, where we can grieve more. Like BJ said, about not always being able to say the right thing when you're talking to someone who's grieving. It's like this with anybody, just acknowledging it in the first place, being able to say, I don't know what to say or what to do, but let's just open up the box is part of this. And I feel like that has happened a lot more in the last year. Now I'm rambling, so I'm going to let you guys take over. But thank you, Gordon.
I can add or just say, Gordon, yeah, thank you for your comments and question here. I mean, this is, and the more we put off letting ourselves feel these things, the bigger the pile gets. I mean, just a couple of reflections. One is, as for those of us who are a little farther down the road, we can model grief to younger people and to elders. I mean, a lot of grief is we all have much to learn from it, and it has not been part of society. So welcoming it, I think there's something really powerful about you, Gordon, the idea of you shedding a tear with young men, for example. What an example that could be. Not to put you on the spot per se, but with your awareness and you're being ahead of the game, just modeling what it looks like to be sad. There's something funny about sadness. I don't know what we humans are. There's something really warm about sorrow. There's something really loving about sorrow. But I also watch many of us, myself included, not be able to just be sad. Then I turn it either into anger or self-recrimination or guilt. I can't, for whatever reason, just being sad is really hard. So anyway, you emoting that way, sharing those emotions and making the link between strength and emotion. I think we usually talk about, well, shedding a tear is a moment of weakness. Bullshit. No, it's really hard to do that. That is, to me, is strength. So a lot of us have to kind of reframe some of this stuff. And we can do this for one another, for ourselves, and in this way model it. That I think generally goes very, very far. So I teach medical students, sometimes, and my daring to be emotional in rounds with people, just that has been really powerful, because they're otherwise taught that emotions have no place in this work, or they gum up your thinking, or whatever message they're getting. And just simply by me being emotional and owning that with them, it has been some of the most sort of the biggest bonds. And I've gotten a lot of thanks from young students around this. So that's one point. A second point here would be, like we were saying earlier, that grief has this way of opening us up internally, that we get more spacious. So part of the modeling is that we can hold multiple emotions at once. So it's not a zero sum, right? It's either I'm sad or I'm happy. No, you could have all of the above. And another thing to model, give yourself space to have all these feelings. They're not at odds with one another unless we point them at each other, but they get to coexist. So you holding all those emotions for yourself and others, I think, is a beautiful way forward. It's not one or the other. And then lastly, I think there's a micro every time to kind of keep, like, grief, when there's a tenderizing, like we've said, that's so gorgeous. But I've watched so many people and families come towards the end of their sort of 6-month mark, which is sort of something we've held out in medicine and somehow magical. It's not, but that you watch the tenderness close down as they re-enter the world and they scar down and get tough again in that classic way. But we can hold that gate open a little bit longer by just noting that keeping that tenderness alive somewhere. So maybe it is every time we hear the name George Floyd, we put our hand on our heart for a quick second, just let ourselves feel something before we cruise on. Little things like that, I think, can go a long, long way. Having an altar at home or a touchstone, something that you look at that allows you to not just think about all these losses, but actually feel them, even just for a moment. I think that's a really good way to keep these doors inside of ourselves open. Small, teeny little things, but if we don't do them, that's when things start stacking up. So anyway, those are some thoughts.
I have just a couple that I'd like to add, if it's okay. First, I want to start with an acknowledgement about the grief over the future and how that does feel like it leads to apathy and therefore nihilism. Certainly, time and again, living in a Black body in this country comes a time where I don't hold big hope for change in the future for what it is like to live here now and in the future. And sitting with that loss of hope it's tough. It's very, very tough to continue to find meaning in the day-to-day. And nihilism is a perfectly understandable space to dip into. I've been there myself where I'm saying, well, what's the point? What's the point? What I've found for myself is rather than try to find continual big meaning, I am finding it in the little meanings. And I'm also finding hope in the little ways. That one conversation I have with my white partner who has some thoughtful ideas about how to engage his mother in her race relations, the way in which me and somebody who were in line together worked together to make sure that the cashier who was almost falling down was supported, finding it in the little ways while also staying present to and grieving the big ways in which it's difficult to live here like this. So I wanted to acknowledge that because it is a very, very powerful idea and thought and a challenge to continue showing up for the world and for life in a country that does not acknowledge our existence. It's a big one when it comes to grief. It's a big one that I think goes unacknowledged also in the community, in the Black community overall, is that we're in a constant state of grieving the past, yes, way back then, the present, and also a future that will likely never look the way that we think that it should look. Thank you, Gordon.
I think BJ's right though about modeling it too, especially men, like if we're not allowed to be sad, you guys definitely aren't allowed to be sad, like men are put in such a different box with grief and with emotions and with vulnerability. And I'm thankful that we have a president right now who models open grieving and vulnerability and emotions, especially right now, as so many people in this country are grieving. But I think more modeling, more men modeling, more different versions of grief, less shaming. These are all such important things. I'm going to hop off in a moment because I have some clients to attend to, and I'm going to hand it over to BJ and Alua as we do some breakout sessions, but I hope to see as many of you as possible at this retreat. I really look forward to kind of gathering, all becoming ambassadors of grief, modeling it, processing it. We're going to cry together. We're going to laugh together. This is what BJ and Alua and I do when we hang out, just the three of us. And it's going to be, I don't know, I think it's going to be multitudes. I think you used that word earlier, BJ, and I'm really excited about it. It's at a beautiful place in North Carolina called the Art of Living. And I don't know, I look forward to having this conversation continue because it's going to be continuing for us no matter what. So we may as well actually let it out and talk about it in a beautiful place with each other in a safe space. I love you guys. Thank you for this. Thank you to everybody who is here today too, just for showing up and continuing these conversations. It is such a big deal to kind of do that. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Claire.
Hope to see you soon, Claire.
See you soon, guys.
In
Thanks, Reimagine.
In addition, I also want to acknowledge you all for showing up today for this conversation about grief because it's a dense one. And you've taken an hour and a half out of your day to be in this discussion with us. And thank you for doing so. I think now is probably a pretty good time to let you all have an opportunity to talk with yourselves. Oh, Dara?
Well, there was a question
Oh,
in the
sorry.
chat that I just wanted, I think it'd be nice if you guys responded to, and then we can
Mm.
breakouts. So Vivian asked, how long did it take to get to where you are now? So full of wisdom, I feel like I'm on a roller coaster of being okay and really not okay, or just not wanting to accept what my new reality is with grief, even though it's been almost 6 years of losing my parents suddenly.
Mm.
Vivian, I hope you're giving yourself a whole lot of grace and ease. I don't know anything.
Mhm.
I don't know anything. I'm doing my best every single day with what it is that I've got. And if your best today still says that it hurts a lot and you're struggling to come to terms with that, that's okay with me. That's completely okay with me.
Right on. I would just echo that. I mean, I think one thing, please don't be seduced, guys, because we're up here sort of facilitating a conversation that we have this down. I don't know what that would even look like, because part of what we're saying here is to give yourself the full breadth of emotion. Let it all come in. So this is inherently a work in progress. I mean, so be careful about being seduced that someone outside of yourself has this down. No, this is just and it took me probably about 6 years to really even acknowledge the loss of my sister. Back to my own example. I mean, so this is nonlinear, part of rolling with, and part of, I think, why we like to point out that death is a part of life or loss is a part of life, that these are related, is so you don't feel like, gosh, I'm still so sad I lost my parents. When am I going to get back to life? This is life. So, and those kinds of conceptual or construct changes have allowed me to kind of roll with it and not feel like I'm somehow squandering my time or behind or something like that. So I think that's, and for my money, what I've come to in terms of my own sense of emotional well-being, for me, each of us gets to say, but for me, it's something to do with when I can get to sadness, when I can get to joy, when I can get to all these different zones relatively easily. In other words, I don't think of health as being bulletproof happy. I don't know what the hell that would look like. I mean, I probably wouldn't trust anyone who was projecting that. Rather, no, I want to have a sort of an ease of moving into sorrow, moving into guilt, moving into all the things that we feel, but not staying there. If I can kind of keep my carburetors clean, then I can move through these states and not get hung up for too long without moving on to the next one. And it's this dynamic thing that's moving through us all the time. And I think, I don't know, Vivian, for your example, but I wonder what would it look like if you, in a way, just gave yourself all the space in the world, dropped any friction of that you should feel or be anywhere else but where you are. And I wonder if that little bit of getting out of your way would open up a different kind of vibe moving forward, a different kind of ease. I don't pretend to know, but that's in my experience. Once I get out of my own way, I'm always surprised at how things can move. Well, so what we've got left, we've got another 10 minutes or so, 12 minutes or so, right, guys? So did I miss a prompt? Shall we sort of open up? Are there more questions? Anyone want to share any sort of takeaways from the small group? Dara, was that in line with what you were thinking?
I think just, I think it would be nice to hear, both in the chat, but also verbally. And if you are interested in kind of sharing, something from your experience in the chat, or sorry, in the small group, that would be wonderful. And you can raise your hand and I can make sure you're unmuted. And I see Sasha. Sasha, can you unmute yourself?
Sure can. Hi. First of all, hi. Really, this is amazing experience. My question, because this is an amazing experience and to me very valuable, I'm also a death doula, partially because of Alua. I actually took a program through University of Vermont, but I've been following you for quite some time, and you really have welcomed me into this space at a time when there's no community. And that's really part of my question. I didn't catch the name of the person who asked the last one, but he was commenting on the state of things and this huge reckoning that, I mean, I'm in America. I know we have people from all around the world, but it seems like this is a global thing that's happening. We're talking about racism and sexism and colonization and equity. And in the wake of this pandemic, something I've seen a lot of dialogue around is going back to normal. And a lot of responses that, I don't want to go back to normal. We shouldn't go back to normal. We should go back to something better than what was normal. And how, as grief professionals and death doulas, how do you propose we do that? What's your plan? But, I know you don't have all the answers, but just, like what, a little bit of your perspective on how to make a world that's a little more inclusive and safe and comfortable.
Go for it.
Oh, I was just, yeah, big question, but I'll kick things off here. But first of all, I'm super with you, Sasha. The phrase returning to normal terrifies me. Terrify, I don't know if that's the right word, whatever, bothers me. Because A, is that possible? And B, would we want that? What about what's this going back thing? Because like a lot of us know from my own experience, we've gone through so much of the pain. There's still plenty more. But the reason to go through that pain is you move through it and you, like we've been talking, you get bigger, your eyes get wider. And there's such an opportunity here for us we're amidst an existential crisis en masse, that we could pop through this and be very clear, not just in our ideas, but in our bodies, know that we need to revisit our structures, our systems, right? For all the man-made stuff that has not been accommodating the lived reality of too many of us for too long. And that is, the good news here is that that's bleedingly obvious now to most of us. And therefore, we can build something better. We can create something better if we hang out with this pain long enough, if we realize this pain is part of life, not the detour from it, like we've been saying. So there needs to be some sort of truth and reconciliation moment, a transition, some sort of safe place to continue to vent all that's been wrong. I mean, I think we've been trying to keep pain at bay, which makes sense, but what we've been doing is we've been keeping reality at bay, life at bay, justice at bay in our effort to not hurt. So somehow we need to realize that we are hurting, whether we own it, move through it, and rope that into how we think about the future and revisit all of our structures. And maybe that's for each of us on our own little ways. So the next time my neighbor's hurting or my colleague's hurting, instead of pretending otherwise or keep on moving, maybe I'll take a minute and say, hey man, I see you. Anything I can do, whatever. I feel you. Just making little changes in what we do when we bump up against pain, whether our own or another's. On this little level, a little bit of compassion where we're used to be numb or shut down or unaware, that I think that we should have some faith that lands, that goes somewhere. Daring to feel something goes somewhere. Gordon said in our breakout group, so beautiful, the power of being affected. What a lovely thing to offer someone else is to actually be affected by them. Doesn't necessarily mean you got to do anything with it, but just start by having the feeling. So anyway, I'm rambling. Like, over to you, Elu. There's a lot to say about this, but I do think that grief and some sort of truth and reconciliation transition moment here will allow us to be clear on what we want to do differently going forward and all the opportunity we still have, even amidst all this loss. I have faith in that because I see families do this in their own existential crises all the time. And here we have this group thing to work from. So, yeah.
Yes, I want to echo all of what BJ just said and also acknowledge you, Sasha, for asking the question because it's a really important one. Similarly, I'm not a real big fan of going back to normal because I don't ever know what it was to begin with. So I don't know what it is that we're supposed to create going forward. My hope is that we all continue to use what we learned and alchemize it, turn it into something that actually works for our lives and our society as a whole. I was also thinking, that one of the ways in which I've been watching people be with it is an acknowledgement of what they didn't know before, and also a little bit of space to grieve what they didn't know before and who they were before, because things are hopefully a little different now. But if they are a little different now, then how do we reconcile who we used to be, what we didn't know, how we were in ways that were harmful to other people with what we now know, and grieve the space in between? Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we need to give white people space to grieve white supremacy. But what I am saying is that we get to look at who we were and where we're going, like I was talking about, that space in between. Also really important to continue to pay attention to the fact that we're not going to be the same, to allow ourselves to be affected, not only by our fellow person, but also by the events, the things that have happened. I was on a panel at the beginning of the pandemic, and his name is, Zach Willett. And he's a chaplain. And we were talking about lifting weights and I hadn't been in the gym and how it was hard for me and whatever else, my little grief that I was so upset about not being able to work out. And he said to me, well, wouldn't you want to be different at the end of this? Don't you want to be affected by it? Shouldn't we let it change us? And it was so profound for me. Yes, I absolutely want to be changed by what has happened. I want to be changed. I don't want things to go back to normal. I don't want the conversations to just pretend that things aren't happening. And I think that, as BJ said, beginning with naming that something important has happened in our society. It's happened for us as individuals. It's happening in the individual. It's happening in society. As long as we continue to call attention to it, name it, we're not going to let it die off. I also don't know that I can live in the state that I was in the end of May 2020. I can't live like that. I can't live like that. There is some numbing that has to happen so that I can continue being with life and being with work and being with people out there in the world. And how I choose to not be with that, how I choose to numb and distract and continue to alchemize that pain moving forward is how things ultimately move forward, I believe. But it's not dying. It's not going away. It's just not being as acknowledged.
I want to say one more thing on the heels. Do we have I know we're running out of time and maybe other questions. Are there other questions out there, guys? Or should we keep going on this?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about anticipatory grief because that came up in our group with a couple of us. And given what you had said before, BJ, there's loss all around us and everything all the time, always has been, always will be. What other, and sort of what you were just talking about, I think applies, but how else would you approach that so that and deal with it so that you don't totally become focused and obsessed, quite frankly, about it? And particularly as you're dealing with people around you that you know are going to die or situations where there will be losses. How do you deal with the anticipation? And some of it may be a manufacturer in your own head because you get super sensitized. But can you just talk about just generally anticipatory grief? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ginger. I'll jump in real quick. I mean, so anticipatory grief, guys, is exactly that. Your grief that sets up in anticipation of the loss. And I'm just so glad there's even a word for it, because otherwise it can be this crazy making feeling. Like I've seen it in clients and patients I've worked with, family members all the time. Like, what am I doing wasting time being sad now? My loved one is still here. Why I'm wasting, getting upset with themselves, like they're wasting this precious time to be happy with this loved one before they lose them, etc. And so point the first, Ginger, is simply just like you've just done, is just name this is a real phenomenon. We humans are such a funny species. We have this really interesting relationship with time. Back to Gordon, he was talking about in our small group about the power of presence. I mean, the future is conjecture and the past is prologue. That is true, but we shouldn't demean those. I mean, that's true enough, but we human beings, we walk around with this relationship to the past and this relationship to the future. And I don't think we're going to get very far if we deny those relationships. I think we just have to keep them in their place, I think, is part of the trick. And why being present with one another is such a profound skill when some of the animals we live with do this inherently. We've got to learn that. It's not easy. But so I just begin to name that and roll with these human compulsions, but keep them in proportion. So I think the first step here is just acknowledging that anticipatory grief is real. And I guess I'd be back to as a general sort of bit of counsel around it is, this is a moment where to not get in your own way. Let your feeling come, let the feelings come. And if you let them come, they'll usually go sooner too. If you drop your own resistance, I shouldn't be feeling this way. Well, drop the shouldn't. I feel this way. Okay. Then you're more likely to then also be more than just that one feeling and get hung up on that feeling. Does that make some sense, Ginger? I don't know if that's something of an answer. But yeah, great point. Great point. It's a very real phenomenon.
We're out of time. I was also going to add the practice of presence is one that I use often with clients that are sitting deep in anticipatory grief. It's bringing them back to where we are today. Controlling what I can, controlling what they can in the immediate. Remembering that now is now. Finding the feet, that practice of finding your feet, either by paying attention on all corners of the feet, foot bath, something to get present in right now. And that's a very quick, fast answer for what is a really dense, nuanced question. Thank you so much for asking it, Ginger. And I think thank you all.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all for showing up as you did, for showing up for each other in our own grief, loss, and conversation, for showing up for yourselves for this last hour and a half to be with your grief and grieving and with that of your fellow human. This is a lot of fun.
Right on, guys. I agree. This is how things will happen. Showing up like this. This is how change will happen. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, BJ. Thank you, Alua, as always. Yeah, I didn't know how much I needed this today, too. So that was a nice gift to get. And I just want to thank everybody for coming today and just showing up in a really big way today and sharing your stories and your thoughts. So we will be sharing this on in an email, a link to the recording in a day or so. I also am just gonna put the link again to the retreat that they're hosting that I personally am gonna try to go to if I can. And just to say there's also a special 10% discount for Reimagine people. So the code is in there and we'll also put it in an email if you don't capture it right now. But I hope this is a really wonderful start to my week, and I hope it is to all of yours as too.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.